Hi, welcome everyone to Washington Crossing Historic Park's presentation of Who Was Here, highlighting the individuals who crossed the Delaware and fought in Trenton and Princeton. For those of you who have been following our lecture series for the past couple of years, you know that the Who Was Here talk has become an annual event. And what we try to do is highlight a few of the Patriots who were part of George Washington's crossing of the Delaware and the battles of Trenton and Princeton, which are commonly known as the 10 Crucial Days. Before we get started, there, of course, is a little bit of housekeeping. So let's get to that before we get started. This session is being recorded for training and record-keeping purposes. By participating in this session, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of this session. At any time, if you have a question or comment, feel free to place that in the chat box and we will respond to you as soon as possible. If you would like to ask your question or to comment verbally, please note that by doing so, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of your statements recorded as part of this session. I also want you to be aware of the fact that we're actually not going to be taking any questions verbally, so all questions should be submitted in the chat box. The presentation is, roughly 40-45 minutes, and then my co-host, Catherine, is going to join us, and we're going to sort through as many of the questions as we can and answer those. As I said before we started to record, I'm going to ask everyone to make sure that your cameras are turned off so that we can highlight our sign language interpreter who has joined us for this program. And with that, let's get started.
Sorry to interrupt, Kim. There seems to be some technical difficulties with some sound. Those of you having issues with sound, I'll send it in chat, but make sure that you have your sound on your device.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me, Catherine?
Sorry.
Catherine,
I can hear you, but we're getting some comments in the chat about it.
Okay.
Yes, I can, but again, we're getting comments in the chat about it.
That other people can't hear me. All right.
Correct.
I don't have my mute button on. So, and since you can hear me, I don't know.
It seems to just be
Random?
Yeah, it seems to just be a handful of people, so.
All right, well then let's proceed. Yeah. I'm sorry if you can't hear me. If you have any suggestions, please put them in the chat box and maybe Catherine can jump in and help out. Sorry about that. All righty, let's begin. Our first Patriot is Thomas Peters. Thomas Peters was a member of the 1st Troop Philadelphia City Cavalry, and that was a volunteer group comprised primarily of professional and prominent men in the city of Philadelphia. He was born on August 1st, 1751, and later in January of 1753, he was baptized at Christ Church. He came from a very prominent family in Philadelphia. And here are some of them now. Oddly enough, when I was putting this presentation together, I was able to find portraits of different members of his family, but I wasn't able to find one of Thomas himself. So I'm sorry I can't share that with you. But if you look at the portraits, you can actually see, I think, a bit of a family resemblance, particularly between William, his father, and Richard, his uncle. His brother, Richard the Younger, who is down here, I think also shares the Peters eyes. So I like to imagine that maybe Thomas had those eyes as well, but I digress. What I want to do here is tell you a little bit about each one of the members of his family. I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. One is that they're just really quite interesting characters, and I want to give you a bit of a flavor of the kind of family that Thomas was from. So with that, we're going to start here, there it is, right here with William, who was Thomas's father. William was from Liverpool, England, and he came to America after the death of his first wife. He settled in Chester County and practiced law in 1739. 2 years later, in 1741, he remarried to a woman named Mary, who ended up being Thomas's mother. He purchased 220 acres on the Schuylkill River in the area that is presently known as Fairmount Park. And he built a home that he called Belmont. This engraving is actually from 1808, so it's many years after Belmont was built. But I think it's just beautiful. It's actually entitled A View from Belmont. And it shows you how wonderful the view is here, how beautiful the area is, and I think explains a little bit why some of the movers and shakers of Philadelphia wanted to have a home here. This is Belmont now. It is still standing. It is in Fairmount Park. It is beautiful. And it is actually presently known as the Underground Railroad Museum. And the reason it's called that is because of a connection with Thomas's brother, Richard, which we'll discuss in a couple of minutes. But this house is where Thomas grew up. William, his father, was commissioned a justice in 1749. He was elected to the Provincial Assembly in 1752 and eventually became the secretary of the Pennsylvania Land Office, which is a job he received after his brother had it and gave it to him. William had a pew in Christ Church. Now, Christ Church was the founding Episcopal church in America. It is in the heart of what is now called Old City, Philadelphia. And it's where Thomas worshiped as a child. And this graphic, I think, is just wonderful. This is a floor plan of the first floor of Christ Church, and it's actually a seating plan dated right around 1760. And you see all of the little blocks on here, and each one of those blocks has a name written in it, and it's the name of somebody who gave money to the church to reserve or take ownership of that pew for themselves and for their family. And right where the arrow is where William's pew was. And in this detail, you see the top name circled is William Peters. And if you look down a little bit, just a few pews behind, you see another name that I'm sure you're going to recognize, that of Ben Franklin. So, from here, you can see that the Peters family really was part of the colonial elite, the Philadelphia elite. Now, in 1760, Franklin was actually still in England, but this would be here for him, for his family. He paid for it. And this graphic is the interior of Christ Church. And if you can see my cursor, right around here at the very bottom of the photo would be where the William Peters had the pew, and it's actually a horseshoe shaped pew, so it's a larger one, and with a seat right about here. So you can imagine Thomas here in 1760 as a young boy coming to church every week. William, his father, moved back to England prior to the Revolution and gave the home, Belmont, to his elder son, Richard. So the son who inherited the home is down here. But before we get to him, we're going to talk about William's brother, Richard. It was right here. He is Thomas's uncle. Richard came here under the veil of a little bit of scandal. I'm not going to get into a lot of it. If you want to talk about it later, we can. But essentially, it involved him marrying somebody that he wasn't supposed to marry. And there was a lot of drama, and ultimately he ended up running away here to Philadelphia. But prior to that, he studied law at Oxford University, but what he really wanted to do was to have a career in religion. And to that end, he was ordained deacon by the Bishop of Winchester and was later made a priest. When he first came to Philadelphia, very briefly, he was the assistant rector at Christ Church. And he made his way up in the political ladder by holding jobs such as secretary of the land office for the Penn family. And the Penn family were the proprietors of the Pennsylvania colony. And that is the job that when he was finished with it, he gave to his brother. He was also the secretary of the province and the clerk of council. He also had a lot of impressive social ties and business ties. There are actually some letters that still exist of correspondence between him and Benjamin Franklin. And there's one that I found really amusing where Benjamin Franklin was actually teasing him about his poor penmanship. They ended up having a falling out later, but that just sort of gives you a little bit of an idea of who he was talking to. Toward the end of his life, he actually went back to Christ Church and became rector there. He ended up dying in 1776, just as the Revolutionary War was starting. Finally, right down here at the bottom, we have Thomas's older brother, Richard. He is the one who received the house from his father. Richard studied at the College of Philadelphia, which you now know as the University of Pennsylvania. He graduated valedictorian in 1761 and then studied law and became a lawyer. He was very involved in the Patriot cause in the Revolution. He led a company of provisional troops and was secretary of the Board of War from 1776 to 1781. On top of that, he worked with Robert Morris to secure supplies for the Army throughout the war. And after the war, he became a delegate to the Continental Congress. When Washington was president, he appointed him to be a judge of the U.S. District Court for Pennsylvania. And President Washington visited Belmont. Richard was also a member of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. And that is why the house is now the Underground Railroad Museum. So I know that was a little bit off the track, but I wanted to tell you some stories about Thomas's family, just so you have an idea of how he grew up and in the environment in which he grew up. So as for Thomas, as an adult, he joined one of the many social clubs in Philadelphia for men of his social standing. This club was called the Schuylkill Fishing Company, and as far as I can tell, it actually still exists today. It's an angling club, so it's a fishing club. He also was a member of the Gloucester Fox Hunting Club. And the reason that this is relevant to this talk is because a lot of the members of both of these clubs were who formed the Philadelphia First City Cavalry. It was actually originally known as the Light Horse of the city of Philadelphia. The cavalry was formed in November of 1774 at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. It was done after the Continental Congress had spent the day trying to determine the best way to enforce the non-importation resolutions against Britain. So, the Congress met all day, and these fellas came together afterward in Carpenter's Hall and decided to form the troop, as it's known, or the cavalry. I use the terms interchangeably here. Here we have the regimental flag for the troop. The troop itself was made up completely of volunteers, and they supported and equipped themselves. So they weren't dependent upon financing from the colony. In December of 1776, the troop was headquartered in Newtown, Pennsylvania. On December 25th, when Washington crossed the Delaware, they crossed as part of the rear guard for the Army. They followed Washington in General Greene's column and served as an escort for Washington and his staff during the Battle of Trenton. Some members of the troop were actually involved in capturing a group of Hessians that had taken positions in a barn during the Battle of Trenton. Several years later, in 1815, the troop published a history of their organization. And Thomas Peters, being one of the founding members, had a copy of that history. And what's really wonderful is that he made notes in the margin about his personal experiences. So he said that when the British Navy was on Long Island, he and a few other members of the troop went to Washington and offered him their services. They stayed with him until the Second Battle of Trenton, when they then rejoined the troop. Regarding crossing the Delaware on Christmas night, Thomas said, "I leapt my horse too soon out of the boat and got very wet, and in this condition was compelled to remain until after the battle, from which I was disabled by inflammatory rheumatism." After the winter campaign, General Joseph Reed wrote a narrative about the events that occurred during the winter of 1776 and 1777. Now, because Reed was from Trenton, he was tasked with procuring intelligence regarding the location of the enemy. He says he took 7 members of the troop back to the area with him to do this, and he named Thomas Peters as one of the members that he took with him. During this little expedition, they found out that the British were at Princeton and were going to be headed to Trenton. In his notes of the history, Thomas actually concurred with what Reed said. And he actually told a story saying that during this time, the members of the troop observed a British foraging party as they were entering a house in order to plunder it. The Americans rushed the British, and 11 of them were compelled to surrender. They were taken prisoner and marched toward Trenton. Now, George Washington was, by all accounts, very happy about this because he was able to learn a lot of valuable information. First of all, these soldiers identified themselves as being part of the Queen's Light Dragoons from Ireland. And according to Thomas, they were very fine-looking fellows. And they revealed that the British had between 7,000 and 8,000 troops. After the campaigns in Trenton and Princeton, in 1777, Thomas was appointed the Commissary General of Prisoners by the Continental Congress when they were meeting in York, Pennsylvania. He said, a few days prior to the Battle of Germantown, he went to Philadelphia where he remained. Around 1783, 1784, he decided he'd had enough of fighting and wanted to start a business. So he decided to go to Baltimore and establish a brewery. He says, I then formed the plan, which I established in Baltimore, of a brewery on the most extensive scale of any in America for the purpose of brewing to serve the American and French troops. Before I could get to work, peace and independence took place, to the failure of my plans, as the brewery was by far upon too large a scale for the use of Baltimore. So what does this mean? It means he decided he was going to leave the war and open up a brewery where he was going to sell beer, brew beer, to sell to the American and French army. And he bought the land, he built an enormous building, and then the war ended. So there he is in this business with this huge building that's too big for normal scale brewing. In 1783, when he arrived in Baltimore, he married a woman named Rebecca Johnson. And at that time, he was also forming this business. He took on a partner by the name of Edward Johnson Jr., who later became the mayor of Baltimore. And several years later, in 1800, he had another partner named Dr. Edward Johnson Sr. I think it's probably not a coincidence that everyone's name here is Johnson. Surely they were part of the same family. Now, Thomas Peters, when he had this brewery, maintained a lot of his social and political and business connections. And to that end, he contacted George Washington in the fall of 1786 because he wanted to sell Washington spring barley for Mount Vernon. And here we have the letter, one of the letters actually, from December of 1786 that Washington sent back to Thomas Peters. And you can see up here Thomas's name, and right over here, Washington's signature. In this letter, I think we might be able to see a little bit through a window of what's about to happen in Thomas's business, because around 1803 or so, his business partners actually push him out of the business. This is a transcription of the letter, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but a part of it says, from the number of fruitless inquiries I have made for spring barley before I applied to you, and the intervention between the date of my letter and your answer being considerable, I despaired of obtaining any of this grain, and therefore seeded the ground, which was at first designated for this crop, with wheat and rye. So it seems that Thomas sent him the letter. Washington was interested, he replied, and then heard nothing from him for a while and got pretty frustrated. So it doesn't seem like a very astute way to do business, but that is what happened. So by 1803, Thomas has been pushed out of the business that he established. And in 1812, the country was at war again. In Baltimore, a woman named Mary Pickersgill was commissioned by the commander of Fort McHenry to sew a flag for the fort that measured 30 feet by 42 feet. You will know it as the Star-Spangled Banner. When the flag became too large for her to piece together in her home, she ended up taking it to this brewery to lay it down on the floor and to sew it together. So Here we have a rather tenuous connection, but there seems to be this line from Washington crossing the Delaware to the manufacture of the Star-Spangled Banner. Thomas died on December 24th, 1821. Our next patriot is a man named Philip Rodman. Rodman was born in 1754. He was a soldier of color and applied for his pension on May 18th, 1820. When he enlisted in the Army, according to his pension, he enlisted under the name Philip Wormsley. Later, he changed his name to Philip Rodman. It's a reasonable question to wonder why he changed his name. And unfortunately, in his pension, he doesn't specify exactly what happened. However, it was not uncommon for enslaved individuals to be given the last name of the family that owned them. And if an enslaved person gained their freedom, it was also not uncommon for them to change their surname to something of their own choosing. And so there are some pension applications for soldiers of color who specify the fact that when they were in the Army, they served under one name, but now they had another. Philip does not make that specification in his application. So I can't tell you for certain if that's what happened with him or if he was enslaved at the time that he served. But what you see here is the signature from the signature page of his application. And you see both names, Philip Wormsley and Philip Rodman. And right in the center, you see an X. And it says his mark, which indicates that Philip was not able to sign his name. So instead, he signed with an X. And the handwriting here is probably the handwriting of the clerk in the court who filled out the application on his behalf. Philip was a private in Colonel Lippett's regiment, which was in Colonel Daniel Hitchcock's brigade. And this was the Rhode Island State Troops. And you see here we have the cover page from the abstract of Colonel Lippett's regiment. Philip's pension application states that he enlisted in October of 1776 and served until November of 1777, 1 month over his required 12-month enlistment. He states that he did that at the request of General Washington, who asked soldiers to stay for an additional month. He says he fought in White Plains, Princeton, and Trenton, and that he was honorably discharged by George Washington. Unlike some other pension applications, Philip's does not have a detailed narrative of his experiences when he served. However, some of his fellow soldiers who were also in the same regiment did either write letters or keep journals and where they talked about their experiences. So from those, we can extrapolate that Philip would have had very similar experiences. For instance, a fellow soldier named Sergeant John Smith wrote that the regiment arrived in Buckingham in Bucks County on December 20th. The next day, on the 21st, they marched 4 miles to Makefield Township and then to Newtown and finally to Bristol, where they arrived before nightfall on December 22nd. And they joined Cadwallader's brigade in Bristol. Now, a quick background of what happened with Cadwallader's brigade. on Christmas night, they attempted to cross. In fact, they did cross. They crossed the Delaware. They get to New Jersey. However, they were not able to get their artillery and horses up the river embankment because of all of the large and very thick sheets of ice that were piling up there. So Cadwallader made the decision to bring everybody back to Pennsylvania. And in fact, during that, a lot of soldiers reported actually being able to hear the cannon fire that was occurring during the Battle of Trenton. But of course, they weren't able to participate because they were still in Bristol. On December 27th, they decided to cross again. And initially, the militia got across, and then Cadwallader received information stating that Washington had actually come back from Trenton and was now in Pennsylvania again. Well, he's faced with a dilemma. He's got half of his guys already in New Jersey and half standing on the shoreline in Pennsylvania. So after consulting with some of his officers, they decided to just go across, go to New Jersey, and then they marched to Burlington. The next day, on the 28th, they continued to Bordentown, where the Hessians had just fled and actually left behind a lot of their provisions. On the 29th, they continued to Crosswicks. And then on January 2nd, they went to Trenton and fought in the Second Battle of Trenton. Now, the Second Battle of Trenton took place at the Assunpink Creek, at the bridge there that went over the creek. And again, from some of the descriptions from other members of Lippitt's regiment, we can understand what Philip experienced during this time. So this description is from John Howland, and he says, "The noble horse of General Washington stood with his breast pressed close against the end of the west rail of the bridge, and the firm composed and majestic countenance of the general inspired a confidence and assurance in a moment so important and critical." Daniel Smith wrote, "The artillery which was stationed at the end of the bridge opened up on the enemy's van and swept them from the bridge as often as they attempted to cross. The bridge looked red as blood with their killed and wounded and their red coats." Now, before we move on, these are actually for after the war, the images that you're looking at now, but I want you to, when you think about those descriptions, imagine that Philip was there. He was there with Washington. Hold on. I think I may have jumped ahead too soon. Let me see. Nope, I've got it. All right. Sorry about that. He was there with Washington. He experienced, this carnage at the Second Battle of Trenton. He was with Washington in Princeton and saw him charge the battlefield and during the battle. And, these are the types of things that a lot of the soldiers witnessed and took with them for the rest of their lives. And Philip would have been no different. After the war, according to the 1790 and the 1800 census, which you can see right here, Philip lived in South Kingston, Rhode Island. And if you look, I'm sorry, the 1790 census is not that easy to read, but you can see a little bit here with the 1800. Right here is Philip Rodman. And right below him is a woman named Celia Rodman, and she is identified as being Negro. Now, the columns you see next to all of these names are for some detailed information that you would get about the household. So the column headings would be things like number of free white men over the age of this, or the number of free white men under the age of this. And toward the end, there's typically a column that will say the number of slaves in the house, and then a column for the number of free African Americans in the house. And that is where you see these numbers right here. For Philip Rodman's home, there were 8. For Celia Rodman's, there were 6. Now, I don't think that Celia Rodman was his wife, because at this time, the only names that appeared in a census were the head of household, and women typically only showed up there if their husband or father was no longer living. So I think this is probably a blood relative, perhaps a sister of Philip's, but very clearly he is listed as being free. Here we have printed version of some of the pension roll of 1835. So Philip is right here. He is a second entry on the page. And thankfully it is printed, so it is much easier to read than some handwritten documents that we see. But you can see that he was a private in the Rhode Island Regiment here. He received $96 of an annual allowance, and up to that point, he received a total of $129.06. But what's very interesting, if you scroll over, you see that his pension was suspended under the Act of May 1st, 1820. So what's that? On May 1st, 1820, an act was passed that required pension recipients to provide a schedule of their assets to prove financial need. The 1818 Pension Act was only available to veterans who were impoverished. And typically, what you would do when you're making your application for the 1818 pension would be that you would just testify in court that you were impoverished. And that was enough at that point. By 1820, they amended that rule and now required you to provide documentation to prove that you didn't have any money. And what it ended up doing was kicking a lot of veterans off of the pension rolls, and it kicked Philip off the pension roll. Now, some were eventually reinstated, but there isn't any indication that Philip was ever allowed to receive a pension again. This is from his actual pension file. And the note that we see at the top is from a man named Wheeler Martin. Wheeler Martin was a prominent judge in the Court of Common Pleas in Rhode Island, and he took the initial application and supported his application later in 1820 after he had been kicked off. And he attests that Philip was worth $20. Finally, what we have here is a probate record. I think it is Philip Rodman's probate record. It is for somebody who died intestate, that is, without a will. And the reason I can't be completely sure it is from 1825 is because right here, you see, it doesn't say Philip Rodman, it says Philip Wormsley. And you remember that's the name under which Rodman enlisted, and it identifies him as a man of color. Another indication that this might be Philip Rodman is the fact that Wheeler Martin's name appears all over this document. And what it's doing is actually making Wheeler Martin the executor of Wormsley's estate. And so I think this is him. Unfortunately, we can't be sure. And as I said, there's no solid documentation explaining why Wormsley and Rodman were names that he used interchangeably. Our next Patriots are members of the Geyer family. Now, if you have attended the Who Was Here lectures in the past, you know that we always have a curious case. And in this case, the curious case is of the Geyer family. This is definitely a case where my desire to find information about these people outweighed my ability to get results. You know, in all cases, historians prefer to use primary source materials when learning information about people, and that would be marriage records, baptismal records, pension applications, census, tax records. Sometimes, though, we are not able to precisely pinpoint an individual in these documents for a number of reasons. One is that if it's a very common name, then you might have multiple people with that name in the same area. Another is that sometimes families moved around a lot, and that appears to be the case with the Geyers, that they did move to several locations within Pennsylvania. But sometimes using primary source documentation isn't always possible. Sometimes you have to use secondary sources like family histories or local histories, oral traditions to fill in the gaps. But we are going to start with our first patriot of the Geyer family, Peter Geyer. Peter was born in Sweden around 1734, 1735. Swedes were amongst the first European settlers to come to Pennsylvania in the early to mid 17th century. And there were several Swedish settlements along the banks of the Delaware, stretched into modern Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. And while there was never a huge influx of Swedish settlers, they did continue to come to Pennsylvania throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. So what we're looking at here is a page out of the Lutheran Seminary book. It's actually called The Lord's Supper Guests in the St. Michael Congregation in Philadelphia. You'll see at the top, the year is 1760. And about 3/4 of the way down the page, I've circled a name called Peter Geyer, and this Peter Geyer's age actually matches our Peter Geyer. So I think this may be him. St. Michael's Church actually, sadly, just closed a couple of years ago in 2016. It was located in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, because of the, at the time, strong German Lutheran population in that area. It was established in 1728, and the famed Lutheran missionary and pastor, Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, was a pastor of the church in 1743. So Peter Geyer and his family show up again in the record in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania in 1776, where he joined the 2nd Battalion of the Pennsylvania State Rifle Regiment. Now, this regiment, like a lot of regiments during the war, underwent multiple name changes and assignments. Ultimately, it's known as the 13th Pennsylvania Regiment, but when he joined, it was the Pennsylvania State Rifle Regiment. On October 8th of 1776, the regiment was assigned to General Sterling's brigade. Sterling's brigade was in camp, if you're familiar with our park, in the Thompson-Neely section of the park. Now, this is a brigade, so there are, hundreds and hundreds of men. So Sterling himself was not at the Thompson-Neely house, but the encampment stretched over, many people's properties there, including Robert Thompson's. And again, we don't have any firsthand account from Peter Geyer about his experiences, but there are other members of his regiment who kept journals and wrote letters. For instance, Major Enyon Williams on the 13th of December, 1776, wrote a letter to the Council of Safety for the state of Pennsylvania. And he wrote describing the condition that many of his soldiers were in. He says, "The men are barefooted and very thinly clad and have not received any pay these 3 months." Another soldier, James McMichael, kept a journal. And on December 9th, he wrote that we marched from near Trenton Ferry to Thompson's Mill, near Coryell's Ferry, where we encamped in the woods. Weather very cold. Thompson's Mill is referring to the Thompson-Neely home. And for those of you who don't know, Coryell's Ferry is now called New Hope, Pennsylvania. On December 25th, he wrote, "We have now received the glad news that marching orders have been issued. At sundown, we marched down the Delaware to McConkey's Ferry and crossed at 9 p.m. for Trenton. The weather uncommonly inclement." After the battles of Trenton and Princeton, the Army went into their winter encampment. And then later in the year, you have the campaign for the defense of Philadelphia. And the Battle of Germantown was one of the battles in that campaign. Peter was wounded during that battle. He received a bayonet wound in the groin and a musket ball in the leg. He was discharged on January 1st of 1778 at Valley Forge. It's unknown what he did after his time in the Army, but ultimately he ended up with his family living in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. And in 1820, he died at the age of roughly 84, 85 years old. His widow, Mary, was awarded a widow's pension in the amount of $40 gratuity and $40 annuity for his service. And she was able to get that starting in the year 1826. Now we're going to talk about Mary Geyer. Mary was born in Germany in 1735, and she followed her husband into the Army as a camp follower. For many women, following the Army was a matter of survival. Large numbers over the course of the war followed the Army. They assumed responsibility for many household tasks, including cleaning, mending, nursing care, but most especially laundry. Some of these women were the wives of soldiers and were simply unable to provide for themselves as the men in their families went off to war. Following the Army was a means of survival, and they followed and they took their children with them. George Washington had mixed feelings about camp followers. He had a hard enough time keeping the Army together, equipping them, and feeding and clothing them. So on one hand, having a bunch of camp followers to also take care of added to the burden. However, he also understood that they were completely necessary. First of all, the job that they were doing, the laundry, needed to get done. And the camp followers were doing that. But in this letter that he wrote to General Knox on the 8th of March, 1783, he says, "The number of women and children in the New York regiments of infantry obliged me to allow them provision, or by driving them from the army, risk the loss of a number of men who very probably would have followed their wives." In addition to providing essential services, the presence of the women helped Washington keep men in the army. Many soldiers would seek furloughs or leave the army when their enlistments expired because their wives and children could not survive without them. Some would desert for the same reason. When their families were there, part of the camp, the soldiers were less likely to leave military service. As I said, Mary followed the Rifle Regiment as a laundress, and after her husband died, was able to collect the widow's pension. She died in 1838 at the age of 103. Bravo, Mary. Next, we have John Guyer. John Guyer entered the Pennsylvania Rifle Regiment at the age of 11 as a drummer. You see, his father entered the regiment, his mother was following, and of course, she brought her children, their children, or child in this case, with them. And this is a ledger of payments for the pension. And if you can see my cursor right here, John Guyer, drummer. Now, if you remember what I was talking to you about, it sometimes names are spelled in different ways in the historic record. This is a perfect example. You see right here, it says John Guyer, G-E-Y-E-R, or Guyer, G-I-E-R. Okay. Many drummers in the Army were actually young boys John's age. And their role was actually very important. The drum was used as a means of conveying signals to soldiers during camp and during battle. The drums could signal an army to take such actions as to prepare to march, to move out, to rise at daybreak, to return to their tents at night, to take up weapons, etc. Here we have another pension record, and again, John Guyer, or Guyer, right here, listed as a drummer. Unfortunately, young John did not have any better luck than his father in the Battle of Germantown. He was wounded in the heel and also discharged on the same day, January 1, 1778, at Valley Forge. After the war, and this is a entry from a census, John became a Mason and lived in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, until his death in 1854 at the age of 89. There's a history of Franklin County that states that he had 11 children, and as of 1824, when the history was written, 7 were living. Here we have a slight discrepancy between the local history and the pension records regarding which regiment John served with. The pension records say that he served with the 4th Pennsylvania, but the histories imply that he was in the same regiment as his father. So I'm inclined to believe that he at least started out in the same regiment as his father, because he was so young and he was there and his mother was there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't end up in the 4th PA. But he and his father were both discharged at the same time, at the same place. He received a pension as well of $96 annually. And here we come to our final Patriot of the evening, Abraham Wheelwright. And this, I don't know if I saved the best for last, but I saved someone special for last, if for no other reason than the fact that I'm able to show you a portrait of Abraham, which unfortunately I wasn't able to do for anyone else this time around. And it's extra special because Abraham, as you can see, survived into the age of photography and had his portrait taken. So that's very exciting. Here we have Abraham's birth record. And you see he was born on July the 26th, 1757, to Jeremiah Wheelwright and his wife, Mary. He was born in Gloucester, Massachusetts. In 1780, in Newbury, Massachusetts, he married Rebecca Knight. They had 11 children. And this is Abraham's signature off of his pension application. He applied for a pension on September 11th, 1832, at the age of 75. He would not have qualified, as we see later, for the 1818 pension because he was not impoverished. But there was a later pension act that changed some of the qualifications that you had to meet in order to receive a pension, and the financial qualification was not included. So according to his application, he enlisted in Gloucester, Massachusetts in December of 1775. He was part of the regiment of Colonel Hutchinson, who was in the Massachusetts line. So that was part of Captain Putnam's company in Sullivan's brigade. His application states that he took part in the battles of White Plains, Trenton, and Princeton. He says that in Putnam's division, he was in Putnam's division when he attacked at Harlem Heights, that he marched with Lee's division from Fort Washington to White Plains, and was also with him when they marched through New Jersey, where Lee was taken prisoner. He continued with the army into Pennsylvania and joined as part of the Northern Army. Then, of course, on Christmas night, he crossed back to Trenton and fought in the battles of Trenton and at Princeton. At the end of the year, many soldiers' enlistments were about to expire, and that was the case for Abraham as well. Washington put out a plea to the army to ask them to stay for an additional 6 weeks. And he gave some financial incentive for that. And Abraham took him up on that. And he joined for an additional 6 weeks, serving with General Knox. After those 6 weeks, he was discharged and returned home. So according to his application, he says he served for 13 months and a half. But that's not the end of the story for Abraham. Local histories state that after he returned from the army, he took to the sea and headed to the Caribbean. In 1779, on his return voyage, he was captured and taken to Corkhaven, Ireland, where he escaped. Of course, in 1780, he was back in Massachusetts, where he married Rebecca. After getting married, he enlisted as the first officer on a private ship that had been commissioned by the United States government, which made him a privateer. So his first assignment was on board the brig de Lafayette. His next assignment was on the brig Stark. And when he was on the Stark, he was captured by the enemy and sent to Bermuda. And in November of 1782, he was released as part of a prisoner exchange. And this is the prisoner exchange document that was in his pension file. And down here, you see that Abraham Wheelwright was to be exchanged in a prisoner exchange. After the war, he established a maritime business with his brother Ebenezer, and they did a lot of business in the West Indies. Over the years, he purchased property in Newburyport and Gloucester, Massachusetts. He died in 1850 at the age of 93 in Newbury. I'm going to bring you back, though, to the portrait of Abraham. It's really exciting to be able to see a photograph of someone who served during the Revolutionary War. There are some painted portraits out there of veterans, and you've probably seen published accounts of the various photos of veterans who had their photographic portrait taken. But to be able to identify anyone who served, considering there were thousands whose faces sort of disappeared into the mists of history for us, being able to identify any of them is exciting. Even more so, though, if he was somebody for us who crossed the Delaware. So in a history called Old Newbury, Historical and Biographical Sketches, there is a small description of Abraham, and I want to read that to you to close our program for the evening. And when I read it, please look at the picture and imagine him in this way. He was extremely conservative in his views and opinions, and a devout member of the Presbyterian Church. He dressed throughout his life in the fashion of the 18th century, and was one of the last persons who wore knee breeches and long stockings in Newburyport. So Abraham was a very old-fashioned gentleman. All right, so before we get to questions, I want to thank you for joining me in this year's Who Was Here presentation, and let you know that throughout the year, I host a couple of different programs. There is a book club that meets right now virtually, but on the third Monday of every month. There's no cost to join. You do have to provide your own book, though. There will be another lecture series in 2021, and some evening with the curator programs. Right now, it's up in the air as to what will be virtual and what will be in person, depending on what happens in 2021. But please stay tuned to the park's social media through the Friends of Washington Crossing Park, who co-sponsored this event, and look at their, the park website as well. With that, I am going to stop the screen share here. All righty, and I'm going to introduce Catherine, who is my co-host. Hello, Catherine. Catherine is a volunteer coordinator for the Friends of Washington Crossing Park, and she has been very kind to sit here and co-host this program with me. So thank you.
Absolutely. And Kim, thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
I was glad that I was muted, because I may have squealed at learning about a camp follower and Abraham Wheelwright.
Yay.
From my time with Museum of the American Revolution.
Yes.
Camp followers are my thing. But to our questions, we have quite a few. Two kind of housekeeping, I guess, things. One is that one of our participants is asking, because this is her first lecture with us, are there recordings of previous lectures available?
There are. I'm going to reach out of frame for a second to get something to drink. Hold on. I'm back. All right. All right, thank you. There are. In October, I gave a presentation on ferries and taverns, and in September we had a guest lecturer, John Rees, who gave a talk about his book on soldiers of color. It was excellent. They are both recorded and captioned, and they are available on the Friends of Washington Crossing Park's YouTube page. So please be sure to go there. Again, it's Friends of Washington Crossing Park on YouTube, and you will see actually several videos that they have there. And this one, when it's captioned, will also be made available. And I'm going to ask if some of you have your cameras on, if you could turn them off so that our interpreter remains highlighted for anyone who may need that. Thank you. All right, go ahead, Catherine.
Also, let me find it. So Terry is wondering, are different Patriots featured each year in this annual program?
Yes.
And then Muriel is also asking, did you know about these specific Patriots prior to researching them for this program?
Yes and no. Yes, there are different Patriots every year. The idea of this, you know, most of us have heard of Washington and a lot of the officers, which, by the way, does not disqualify them from appearing in this lecture. But what I'd like to do is shine a light on some of the soldiers who maybe you haven't heard of before. I think it's important to tell people stories and to get to know these folks as individuals. So there are different people every time. As far as knowing any details about these people ahead of time before I research them, I didn't. When I'm doing other research, when I come across somebody's name, I put it aside, I make a note, and then when I'm going to dive into the research for who was here, then I start to look into their background, and I try to bring as much as I can. And as is the case with the Geyer family, sometimes my desire for information is outweighed by the fact that I can't find any. So, but I'm always open. So if anybody has information out there that I didn't cover, you know, I'm on the my emails on the Friends website. Send it to me. I'm happy to have it.
Well, that's actually perfect because we've had quite some interesting discussions in the chat about different ancestors. Also, let me see who asked it. I can't find the name of who asked it, but someone had asked, do we know any of the names of people that are buried in our soldiers' graves?
We know the name of one, Captain Lieutenant James Moore. It, particularly at this early stage of the war, was not uncommon for enlisted men to be buried without markers or necessarily without mention in the regimental record. However, officers were, the loss of an officer usually was noted. And in this case, Captain Moore was second in command to Alexander Hamilton of the New York Artillery. And he, during the winter encampment in March of 1777, Hamilton wrote a letter where he mentions the death of Moore and that he died as a result of an illness. So, and Moore's family apparently had a headstone installed there. So that was really the only person that we know for sure who was there, although we do know that there are other graves there, but we don't know who they were.
So leading into that, Joette is asking if we see a pension file on someone that crossed the Delaware in the battle, that crossed the Delaware and served at the Battle of Princeton, would you want an email with that name and pension number?
Sure.
I had a feeling that would be your answer, but I thought I'd ask it anyway.
I have to find 6 every year, so that helps.
Sure. And before we get to some of the fascinating side note on different family history relating specifically to your presentation, Amy's asking, was Christ Church in Philadelphia, would that have been the Church of England in the 1760s?
It was absolutely, yes.
And I was wondering what, with Peters, I believe you mentioned one of his relatives attended Oxford. Do you know which college he attended?
I do not.
Okay. And then, fair enough.
Sorry.
That's totally fine. And Mark Holland also asked, did Peters's units, the Light Horse, did they also escort Washington from Philadelphia to Boston when he was named commander-in-chief in 1770? I think it was 1775.
I don't know the answer to that. Actually, if you email that to me, I can look into it. I tried to stay focused on exactly what happened for the 10 crucial days rather than going off into many different directions, particularly with the Peters family, because there was just so many juicy details to all of their stories that I could have gone on and on and on.
Absolutely. And then Jennifer is asking, do you know what happened to Peters's brewery? Did it continue after he left the partnership?
It did. The Johnsons continued. They changed the name. They just altered it a little bit. And they kept brewing until I want to say it was 1813 or so. And then they got out of the business and it stayed a brewery for a little while. Eventually, though, it became the National Casket Company. Yeah. And there's a photograph online of it, of the building, and it was massive with a big sign that says the National Casket Company. But the building now is gone.
Then, sorry, I have these in order that they were sent. So moving to some of the family lore that we've had in the chat, we have a descendant here of Frederick Pope. I don't know if you know about him. Kenneth said that Captain Frederick Pope, who lived from 1733 to 1812, fought at Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, the Siege of Boston, Hell's Gate, Harlem Heights, White Plains. He crossed the Delaware, fought at Trenton, the Assunpink, and Princeton. A lot of information, and asked, would you like more for our records?
I sure would. I
I
have a filing cabinet that is just dying to be crammed full of information on these people. So anything you've got, I'm happy to take.
We also have some descendants here of a Hessian named Andre. I apologize, Trisha. I'm going to butcher this name. Eskenbach, I believe. I have it written down.
All right.
So, yeah,
I'll take it.
He was a Hessian who I believe fought at Trenton. Tom Brewster also said that family lore put Samuel Brewster, a boat maker from Philadelphia, at the crossing with Washington. There's a descendant of Dr. Benjamin Rush. One question I had is, did Rush cross at McConkey's, or was he with Cadwallader?
He was with Cadwallader.
That's what I thought. And Terry was also, or Terry Atkinson said that there was also Captain Blount, who took the helm of the first boat to cross the Delaware with James Henry Slack, who was about 20. And many of the people listening are Slack descendants.
Yeah, there are a lot of Slacks in the area still. So, you know, it's still a very present family in the region.
Amanda said that she would love more information on Bucks County history because her Patriot was Benjamin Brooks from Tinicum Township.
Sure. So if you all, anybody who has anything that they want to share, If you go on to the Washington Crossing Historic Park website, there is a drop-down menu for staff, and I'm listed there. You can email me. I am happy to receive any information that you have, because that makes my job a little bit easier.
And then our last question, also from Terry, are the pension records, such as the ones that you mentioned, are they readily accessible by the listeners? And if so, how? And if not, how did you find them?
I found them, frankly, most of them through ancestry.com. If you are able to log into that, I think probably fold 3 is a good reference for that as well. I use Ancestry because I'm looking for more than just pension records. As I'm trying to flesh out these people's lives before and after the war as well. So I like having the additional information, but they do have, where available, pension records. There are also some books that are published that list the names of people who received pensions, and those can be purchased off of from most booksellers.
One other question from me. I know, like I said, I got really excited when you said Mary Geyer is a camp follower, because they're my thing. So she was attached to or with the Pennsylvania Rifles. Would she have been at or around Thompson Neely House?
I think so, yeah.
Yay.
Yeah, I
Okay,
think so. I mean, if
really...
she's following, we know that her husband was for sure. Beyond that, it's an educated guess. And so, more than likely, she's going to follow the regiment that her husband is in. So that would put her there. Now, I suppose it's possible that she followed, there's that discrepancy with their son, John, that she may have wanted to follow if he actually did end up in a different regiment. But, I think it's absolutely plausible that she would have been part of the encampment at Thompson Neely.
And just a little bit, I mentioned this in the chat for everyone, but if anyone is interested in camp followers, definitely I would recommend Holly Mayer's book, Belonging to the Army, Nancy Lone's book, Following the Drum, for more information on that. There's wonderful books about Rush as well. And as a bit of a plug, we are working on and we'll have programs coming up about camp followers, and also hopefully about further information about genealogy and research and things. So we're still developing all of that, but stay tuned for things from the park coming up. Also,
Alrighty then,
we just got one.
All right, one more
last question.
Then we'll let everybody go.
What are the conditions for the camp followers? So super quick, what are the conditions?
Poor.
Yeah.
They were, I mean, we saw that section of a letter from Enyon Williams where he describes soldiers being barefoot and very thinly clad. The camp followers were no better off as far as provisions were concerned, and they were out and exposed to the same conditions as the rest of the Army. Thank you, Catherine, for co-hosting for me. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this event. Thank you, Stephanie, for interpreting. And with that, I'm going to wish you all a good night. And please stay tuned and look at our social media and our website for future events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Stephanie. Bye-bye.